This is the On All Cylinders podcast,
powered by Summit Racing.
Your host for today is Summit Racing's Paul Sokolis, with special guest Max McCroskey, owner of Resurrected Classics.
Here we go.
Folks, it's fair to say that I am positively giddy to talk about today's subject. Paul Sokolis here, your host for this episode of the On All Cylinders podcast. That's because, as a guy who has daily driven an old Nissan Sentra SER for dang near a quarter century, it's fair to say that I am a Nissan fanboy. And today we're going to be talking all about vintage Nissan, specifically the early Nissan Datsun Z car. They're really starting to climb up in the collector's market. So we brought on Max McCroskey, owner of Resurrected Classics. His company specializes in reproduction parts that are OE or better than OE spec for these cars, and he knows an awful lot about them. So we're going to cover Nissan Z car restoration tech, like what to look for, how to go about buying and fixing one up, and all sorts of stuff like that. So Max, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, no problem. I'm glad to be here.
We'll get into the meat and potatoes of this topic here in a bit, but before we do that, let's hear it from you, man. How did you get into this hobby, and how did you get into being a Nissan guy?
So, from an early age, I'd always enjoyed classic cars. My dad was really big into Mustangs, classic Mustangs, and I like those as well. But a friend of mine in high school had a ZX, a 82 280ZX, so a little bit later model. So I saw that, and I thought, I'd never seen something like that before. They're a little rare. And so I did some research about that, and I kind of read about them, and I saw that they had an earlier generation. And so that's how I found the 240Z, the S30 generation. So the earlier models, and then pretty much just I found a project car that was like in really rough shape, but something I could afford. So I bought that, and then I messed around with that a little bit, and then sold that one, bought another one. And just kind of from there, it was like a hobby, and then it kind of became a side business to make some extra income. And then so by then, the more I learned about them, the more, I just really enjoyed them. They're just really cool cars, and they're just a really good value and a great car to begin, for a classic car.
Okay, so how did this passion for these cars evolve into the company you have now, Resurrected Classics?
Yeah, so originally, when I started out kind of in the S30s, in the 240Zs and 280Zs and 260s, I was really just buying and selling them, and restoring them. And I did that for a while. And I started realizing that there's a really big demand for the cars, but the supply of aftermarket stuff has just not caught up. It was, it's not like American cars where there's just this, so many suppliers and ample parts. So, I became kind of frustrated with not being able to find anything. And so I started small, just making floor pans and then some emblems, things that I personally needed in my restorations. I need all the time. That kind of did pretty well. And then so I just kind of started making more parts that I thought were in demand based on just the cars I had, because I started noticing patterns, very consistent patterns of what was needed. I mean, over and over and over, you need this, you need that, you need that. And then there's nothing available. Trying to find used parts, especially metal parts or like rubber parts, things that just really don't age well, is very, very hard. And so we just kind of started with one part and kind of kept building up over time. And that's pretty much what we do now. It's just supplying original style OEM parts for restorations. So metal stuff, rubber, electronics, lighting, fabrics. So pretty much anything you would need for a restoration.
Let's rewind it back just a little bit, because even a Nissan nerd like me, I kind of get confused with all the different naming conventions and generations. You've tossed out Fairlady, you've tossed out 240, 260, 280, you've tossed out S30. Can you kind of break down the distinct Nissan Z car generations we're talking about here?
Yeah, so what we focus on is the S30 generation and S130, but more so S30. So technically the S30 generation, the Nissan S30, it is the Nissan Fairlady Z, which was the 240Z in Japan. They use a different name. And the Datsun 240Z is how they badged it for export. So, your 260Z, 280Z, they're all technically Nissan S30s, but they're badged for export stuff. So that generation encompasses all of those models. So from 1970 to 1978 is the S30 generation.
So Fairlady in Japan, 240, 260, 280, everywhere else. Got it. And now you said that was from 1970 to 1978. And then after that, the S130 generation took over?
Yes. So in 79, it was a Nissan S130. What we saw in the US was the Nissan or Datsun 280ZX. That's what they later went to. They added submodels like luxury and different packages like that they didn't have previously.
So which one out of all those years and iterations is like the hot one for the collector's market? Like what's the most popular you see in your world?
For sure, generation wise, I would say the S30, just because it is, it's earlier, it has more of like that classic look. And, with anything, everybody wants the earliest, most desirable stuff. Earlier, in most cars is typically seen as better. It's just more rare. It's scarce. And so typically people want the 240Z. So that had, the most minimal styling. You didn't have like the larger big bumpers of the 80s. You had very minimal bumpers. It's just a very raw, sports car. So that's kind of the most desirable. But overall, the SR generation, even the 280Z, it looks very much still like a 70s car. It is roughly the same as a 240, some minor differences, but they're very similar looks. A lot of interchangeability.
Digging a little deeper, are there any special models or submodels that a collector or enthusiast should be aware of? Like, I'm thinking the analogy would be like a Corvette ZR1 or an R-Code Mustang, anything like that?
Sure. So there's a couple of things. I'll say there are some that are, Nissan special editions that are factory made, and there are some that I will call them collector created. People have made terms, and I've seen it before in other, kind of like a 64 and a half Mustang. People create their own terms. So a major term is for the early 240Zs is a Series 1. So that is not a factory term. That's not been used anywhere, but it is an accepted term by collectors. So what that means is early 69 production date and 70 production date cars that they have different features. So, very minor stuff, but it does matter. So like the hatches were vented. So they have chrome vents in the back of the hatches. They had early ones that had no defrosters. They had different radios. They had different plastic panels, different toolboxes. So things like that. To a collector, that matters a lot. So those are the most desirable. And then later on with the 280Z, so like 76 to 78, or 77 to 78 different editions. So you had the Zap Z, which was a bright yellow Z that was a limited run, and the Black Pearl, which is the first time they ever experienced with doing black paint. So that's the only time they ever did that from the factory. That's the first time. And so there was it's not exactly written down, but at least 1,000 to 1,500 that were made. So very limited release, and it had metal sport mirrors, louvers, pinstriping. But that was for sure a special edition by Nissan released by them.
Okay. You win. I've gotten bit by the Nissan Z car bug. I want to buy one for a project car. What should I look for when I go to check one out, say from a classified ad or an auction? Is there anything unique to a Z car that a non-Nissan aficionado should know about?
Normally, when I used to look for them, when I would buy and sell them, I think the best way to start is try to find one as original as possible. Even if you do plan on modifying it, start with the most original as possible. Then, first of all, it typically is easier to replace stuff and fix things. And then you get to decide what you want to replace. Because if you find one that's already been modified, you just don't know what somebody's done, and it can end up being a lot of trouble trying to undo things that were not correct, or just it gets confusing, because then you can no longer look at factory manuals or data because your car's been changed in some way. So I would definitely say try to find one that is as original as possible, and try to minimize the rust. I mean, it's hard to find a rust-free car. It really is. But if you can find one that at least doesn't have like severe frame rust, things are removable, like fenders and doors, and that's fine. It's workable, but definitely focus more on the body and originality versus things like the engine. That stuff is typically very simple to find and very easy to work on.
Do these cars have any particular Achilles heel that demands special attention? Like, as an example, just off the top of my head, the battery tray under a Porsche 914 is called the hellhole because it rusts out really bad. And C3 Corvettes around the windshield frame, they call it the birdcage. If that rusts out, you're pretty much toast. Anything like that you should pay special attention to?
So a couple of areas that come to mind. The battery tray for sure is one of them. I guess just because of the angle of how it was, it's kind of like a flat spot. Water could sit there, and I also think too, like older batteries, maybe something like with the acid. If it's like an accident, it would eat away the paint, so that's an issue. But definitely in the battery tray area for sure. And then on the frame rails, I'm not sure really why they did it. Maybe it's for strength, but there's like a certain kind of like a pocket where they layered another piece of metal over it. And so because that layer, it creates, I don't know, it kind of locks it in there. So that's one area. Rocker panels can be bad. Typically, I would just check stuff like frame rails, spare tire wells. they can get clogged. There's like a drain thing, and if it gets kind of seized up, water will sit in there. The hatch slam panel, that's a pretty bad spot. Water can kind of sit there and that eats away. Roofs doesn't seem like they really get too bad, but it's when it's on a sunroof that can be an issue. Stuff like the kind of like the bottom tips of the fenders, that water accumulates there. Debris gets in from like the cow panel, less like leaves or straw, and it's supposed to be able to flow out there, but it gets clogged up, and so that is an issue too.
Okay, so outside of rust and corrosion issues, are there any other facets of the car that demand special scrutiny? Again, just as an example, AMC era Jeeps suffer from notoriously weak axles, or the popular stereotype about English cars and weak electronics. Anything like that someone considering a project car should know about before diving in?
Yeah, so mechanically, they're very reliable cars. They're very stout. It's very rare that an engine is completely seized. I mean, they just were built very solidly. Besides things that I would consider, I mean, average maintenance for any car of that age, like things like bushings, like your rear drums might be seized, things like that. I mean, they're pretty good mechanically. A lot of times, the dashes will crack just because it's very old and the sun exposure. The interior was, a little bit kind of cheaper. You had stuff like the doors were just like a vinyl, almost like a cardboard material that will kind of peel, stuff like that. But mechanically, they're very, very sound. So usually what I would replace whenever I get one in is the fuel pump for sure. The diaphragms get just dried out and they break. Clutch master cylinder, clutch slave, that's very common. But pretty basic kind of wear items, overall built very stout and really, rust is like the main concern.
Now, in a similar vein, what kind of parts are really difficult to replace? Like if you're looking at a project car and it's missing, XYZ, should that be a big concern? I mean, I'm talking things like window glass, carpeting, stuff like that. What's really hard to find?
There are some parts like that, certain rubber parts and plastic stuff. And there used to be, I mean, these are parts that were just not made at all. And so that's kind of what I went for first. And so now parts I would say a couple years ago were really rare. Now, really kind of aren't that rare because we make them and supply them. But stuff, like dashes, that can be really difficult. Yeah, really, really not too much. I mean, main thing is just keeping it original. Things like trim and stuff can be, either kind of rare or kind of, pricey to track down. But really, that's about it. I mean, everything, we're really trying. We target the really rare parts first. We try to, make things like that because we know how hard it is to find those parts, and it's just really difficult.
All right, so say someone took the plunge, bought their project car, they dragged it home, it's now in their garage. Do you have any good blanket advice for how they should go about doing the actual work? Stuff like, be extra careful when pulling this part off, or make sure you don't put your fingerprints on this, or this has a tendency to crack. Anything like that you want to tell people?
Maybe just try, one piece at a time. Immediately take everything apart. People want to get into it and do everything at once. And I think it's a little overwhelming. So I would definitely say to start with things, like maybe get it running and driving first. Do some basic maintenance, try to get it driving at least. But I mean, everything's typically pretty solid. Connections can be very brittle over time. You gotta be careful with that. Like the plastic and they can break, stuff like that. And just general stuff, with anything like with the engine, definitely soak down all of your bolts before you try to mess them because they will snap. And there's a lot of times that, especially like the underside of the car, those bolts are, they've been so long, they just can break. You'd be really patient and just take your time because it may make a small project a very big project if you're not careful.
Yeah, I've seen that movie before. Honey, put a pot of coffee on because I just snapped a manifold bolt. But I digress because I want to ask a really important question concerning the enthusiast community. What support is out there for owners and restorers of these cars? Like, is there a good online enthusiast community where you can go and ask questions and find technical manuals and resources and how-tos to help you through this project?
Yeah. So I would definitely say so. There's a lot, I would say at least 2 or 3 major online forums that are very good. And they have posts ranging from the 90s that are still on there. So it's a very good archive. That's a very good wealth of knowledge. And then for people like a more modern aspect is groups on Facebook. There's groups on there with, with 40,000 members. So pretty large pool and everybody's, pretty helpful. And there's a lot of stuff out there on these cars, a lot of stuff like that. So there's a good bit of resource. I would say as much as any other kind of large car kind of fandom, I would say.
That makes sense because it was a worldwide release, and Nissan made a lot of these cars, right?
Yeah, it's about for the S30s, it's about 600,000 in 8 years.
So, how about Resurrected Classics? Do you have like a tech line where you can help folks through projects and like do you post some assets and resources on your website?
Yeah, as much as we can, I try to give whatever knowledge I have, even on stuff that's not our products and just general advice on these cars that I've learned just from years, just try to help somebody because I know how it is when you first start and it's very hard and it can take them a lot of time. So we do definitely try to do that. And, whatever advice we can, especially about our parts, installing them, and mainly just what we've gathered just from being around these cars for so long and for, restoring many of them and getting a lot of running and driving and just testing our parts on our own stuff. We share, whatever we've kind of come across.
Now, obviously, you can get Resurrected Classics Z-Car restoration parts at summitracing.com. But what's your website for folks that want to get in direct contact with you?
Yeah, so it's just resurrectedclassics.com.
resurrectedclassics.com. And I can see you've got a contact us page where, someone that's got a question on a part or needs restoration advice, they can reach out to you directly.
Yeah, and if I can't directly help them, I would give them a resource, or I can lead them to some place that I have used in the past, or I think that can help them better than I can.
Okay, so far we've been talking about this from like a restoration perspective where you want to make sure the nuts and bolts are all correct the way that left the factory. But let's talk about performance modifications, and more importantly, let's talk about some upgrades that folks may want to do to, I don't know, make their 50-year-old car a little bit better driver. What does the aftermarket upgrade support look like for these cars?
Yeah, so there's a pretty good aftermarket performance support. I guess I'll say that category. And it's kind of some different paths you can go. There's like a OEM kind of enhanced, which is like mostly OEM, but a few things that are just make good sense. Like a big one is points to electronic ignition. I would recommend that. That's a very good one. Some people might add, air conditioning. That's a pretty good one. Upgrade stuff like maybe, front disc brakes, maybe a larger master cylinder, different radio systems like, Bluetooth, stuff like that, different headlights and like that. People do things like that. There's also been some fuel injection things people have done, doing like a coil pack conversion. So that's somewhat OEM. And then in a different sense, you've got like the more performance-oriented ones, which would be like a RB25 swap or like a LS swap. That's a whole different direction. People enjoy that because you get the look of the car, but the power plant is modern and people enjoy that. It's more power. And so those are really popular too now. We've seen a lot more of those. And they're not super difficult to do. The engine bay on these cars is very wide, so there's a lot of options you can do. We kind of see two different directions with that. But yeah, there's a lot of good stuff you can do.
But let's backtrack really quickly because I think it's worth mentioning that a restored Z car, even one that's 50 years old, is still a pretty competent, comfortable driver. Like it'll keep up with traffic and you'll be able to drive it on a fairly regular basis, correct?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, they're very mechanically sound. They're very peppy. They only have maybe 150 horsepower or something like that, but very, very light car, and they just have a very good running sound. They drive really well, handle well. It's a very, very well engineered car. When they designed this car, there's engineering books out there now describing how they would compare themselves to like a Porsche 911, and they wanted to try to take that market. So they really spent a lot of time thinking about how they could achieve that on like a lower budget.
Now, say you bought one of these cars and it's sitting in your garage right now, stock, modified, or otherwise. What kind of maintenance do they need? Does an early Datsun Z car require different care and feeding than, say, a contemporary Camaro or a Mustang?
So I mean, with any classic car, and especially these, battery tenders are really good. Cranking it ever so often is really good. If you can, try to get non-ethanol fuel just for the carburetors. For oil and stuff, you want to add like a zinc additive for the camshaft because a lot of times they don't have that zinc stuff, and that's a good thing to do. But yeah, just running every now and then, that's really just good for stuff like your fuel pump. Needs some oil, and it keeps it kind of lubricated, and the diaphragm keeps it from drying out. So really just, I guess, kind of center maintenance.
Yeah, you're not describing anything that I wouldn't do on any old car, be it a Jeep, Corvette, European, Japanese, domestic, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I've worked on these a lot, and I've also worked on American stuff. I would say just the way they design these is so much, I think, a little more simple, and also just so much room to work in that engine bay. I mean, it's inline six, but the room you have around it is it's a lot. I mean, you really have to kind of look at it to see it. But I mean, just amp room to work with them. I mean, they're very kind of bare bones a little bit, so you don't really have a lot of stuff in your way. No giant, power steering pumps or AC units. I would not say they're a very like a bad first class of car or like very daunting. They're really pretty simple, a very good beginner thing, and then they're not very exotic.
Now that is really interesting to me because, just my knee jerk reaction when I look at a small sports car is that it's just inherently going to be a challenge to work on. Spaces are tighter, it's lower to the ground. But you say this is a really good beginner's style project car. And I know you've touched on it a little bit already, but kind of expound on why you think that is.
Yeah, so the engine bay is very spacious. I feel like that makes a big difference to me at least, and it's just very easy to get around stuff, remove things, do a spark plug change, take the fuel pump out, take the oil pump out. I mean, a lot of times, even just something like an oil pump is somewhat difficult to take out. These can be taken out, 4 bolts, and you just pull it out. I mean, and you can be on the ground pretty much. It's really not bad. The design is straightforward. It's not super really crazy. It's a independent rear, so you can kind of get around stuff. It's not super heavy. It's not like a Ford 9-inch. It's pretty lightweight, so you can grab yourself and let it down. And a lot of smart stuff. Like the transmissions were aluminum, so somewhat lightweight. The head is aluminum, so they really did think about this. They really thought about it, and I think it's a really simple car to work on.
It's funny, not to humble brag here, but I was fortunate enough to have lunch with Peter Brock a while back. He's the famous designer that penned the C2 Corvette Stingray and has a huge connection with Datsun in the form of Brock Racing Enterprises. He fielded a handful of really competitive 510s and Z cars later on in the 70s, and he shared the same sentiment about Nissan. He explained that they were the first Japanese automaker that really reassessed the North American market and designed and built cars that would not only keep up with American traffic and handle American highways, but were also user-friendly enough for the neighborhood mechanic.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fresh design, like you said, and also they really wanted to go after, I would say, targets that were much higher price points than they really. I mean, they didn't really have to compete with the 911. Like price-wise, it's not really the same category, but they wanted to, and not everything ended up getting over to the U.S. side, but just for example, like in Japan after the Fairlady Z, there was an option in 1970 to get a 5-speed, and that's pretty to me pretty good. I'm not sure of many cars that had a 5-speed at that point or a limited slip differential. I mean, that's very exotic for that time. I mean, 8 tracks to 1970. I mean, they really put a lot of soul into it, a lot of thought process and design into it, because this was really their first kind of big break into the U.S. for the sports cars. They really wanted to make a good impression.
And considering you can walk into a Nissan dealership today and buy a brand new Z car is certainly a testament to that fact. But let's swing the pendulum back to Resurrected Classics because I want to learn a little bit about your R&D. Like, how do you go about making a reproduction part for a piece that hasn't been on an assembly line in like several decades? That fascinates me.
Yeah, so really, I guess kind of how we start is we find a really nice sample. And so typically, that would be like a Nissan NOS part, so a brand new part, which for a lot of the parts can be very, very hard. I mean, you're talking about like finding like a rubber seal from like 1970 in the bag. And so it's really hard. But as a result, you get a very, very nice sample that you can scan and send off. So then we make a mold, and it depends on kind of what process it is. If it's like an injection mold, like a vacuum forming mold, or a giant aluminum mold for stamping, like for a fender, stuff like that. So we design the mold, and then we begin to punch out the units. And so all of our items that we have, we don't do any drop shipping. So they are designed in-house. They are manufactured overseas, and then they're imported here, but they are all of our molds. So they're all proprietary, and it's a very long process. So most of the metal parts take about, I would say minimum probably about 2 years. Some even take 3 years. So I mean, they take a long time to develop, but it's because our development cycle is somewhat tedious, but I think it's worth it because we get a sample and I physically test each of our parts. So we install them on the car, we go through it, and we keep in mind how would an enthusiast, how would they like this install process, how what tools we need to just try to make it as simple as possible and focus on the installation and originality aspect. And so each of our parts go through that exact same process. So it takes a long time, but I think in the end, it makes a big difference because going into this, I knew that, aftermarket parts, especially metal parts, got kind of like a bad rap over time. And so people were very hesitant. Well, the original's always better and this, that, and, it's kind of like an uphill battle. And so you really have to make sure your stuff is good to win somebody over, and I understand that point of view 100%. But I think with enough time, devoting more time and really a personal touch, testing it ourselves and seeing how difficult it is, I think you can get the same level of quality.
And what's even more impressive to me is the spectrum of parts you offer, inside and out, metal, rubber, emblems, trim. And I'm particularly curious about your interior pieces because I read on your site that these are like better than new. The materials are used are better than the ones that Nissan used back in the day.
Yes, yeah. So we try to improve without ruining the original look. So like the original plastic panels, for example, they're very, very thin. I mean, they're like maybe a millimeter. They're very thin, very breakable. So ours are a little different plastic and a lot thicker, so they're very flexible. We focus on the things that were the most needed. We start with the sheet metal products. Now we're branching out. We've got rubber hoses, electronics. We have like a complete 240Z wiring harness. We've got lighting stuff, tail lights, fabrics, like seat covers, correct grain seat covers, carpets, even larger metal parts like roofs and radiator supports, something like that were not previously available. And then we also are about to release a line of weather stripping. So all the rubber parts, those are really kind of in demand, especially to, kind of made the correct way. We start with NOS samples. So yeah, we've been growing our catalog pretty steadily.
And emblems too, right?
Yes. Yeah. So emblems, pretty much 70 78. We'd have some S130s, but mostly the earlier type. So emblems, a lot of different stuff, a lot of different materials. And we plan on doing even more too. So this is not, we plan on expanding more.
So let's talk about that for a second. What is in your future plans? Are you going to expand out to like the 5-dime or like the Skyline market, or are you going to keep laser focused on the early Z cars for the time being?
Yes, I think for now, I think we will focus on the S30. I still think there was a good demand for a lot of these parts. So we want to increase our product line, like a lot more sheet metal parts, like even larger parts, maybe, quarter panels, like a full length floor pan, things like that. And then we plan on doing, I mean, pretty much everything that we can. I mean, everything that is sensible that people need, that is in demand, we want to do. So more interior parts, as quick as we can without, sacrificing quality because it does take time. But yeah, we want to keep growing this line.
Yeah, it sounds like you folks are pretty well plugged into the vintage Nissan Z car market. If anyone knows what the community needs, it'd be you folks, right?
Yeah, and so we added on our website because we would get so many requests like that. We add on our website a contact section about like, it's called Suggest a Part. And so pretty much what that is we want to get feedback from people about what they think is most in demand, because really that's where you get the best feedback from. It is enthusiasts. That's the sample size that we want to be reaching, to know what to make next. And so because there's things that we might not have considered. And so that, yeah, we definitely do like to get that feedback.
Okay, you're hearing it. If you've got a Nissan Z car in your garage and you're missing that one unobtainium part, drop the team at Resurrected Classics a line and maybe they can cook something up for you. ResurrectedClassics.com. And I think it's also important to point out that at ResurrectedClassics.com, you also maintain a blog with some technical resources, right?
Yes. So we do have a blog. We post like some general articles, just like about the history of the Z. And then we also post, when we can, we post about like product install videos with our products and just to try to help people methods that we find useful and maybe that they will find useful, but on how to install stuff or what tools to use or what we found is the quickest way or the most effective way. And so yeah, we do plan on adding even more to that, pretty much just helpful blogs and just some good general how to, just like one we added recently was just about paint codes, how, because it's harder than it looks to find the correct paint code. I mean, you have to cross-reference old PPG Ditzler codes with modern stuff. And so we thought, because I've been in the paint shop many times before, and it's hard, and a lot of people don't know. And so we added that. And so yeah, we want to be a very useful archive for people that are just starting out.
Yeah, at the end of the day, Resurrected Classics, Summit Racing, we're all just trying to keep cool cars on the road.
Yeah, I mean, and that's our main goal is that we want to keep the 30s alive, and we want to see the hobby flourish.
And what a fantastic sentiment to start to wrap up with. We've been talking with Max McCroskey all about vintage Nissan Datsun Z cars. He is the owner of Resurrected Classics, and they specialize in reproducing those hard-to-get, unobtainium parts for those cars. And you can find them at summitracing.com. It's worth checking out. Max, before we shut down for the day, do you have any final Nissan wisdom to impart upon our audience?
Really, I would just say for these cars, if you're kind of on the fence about it, really, there's never a better time. I mean, because these things are going to keep going up in value. And I think they're getting very, very desirable right now. And so if you're kind of on the fence about it, I would definitely say to get one. They're not getting any more abundant.
Sorry, I kind of missed that last part as combing Facebook Marketplace for my Z car. But Max, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us. Best of luck to you in the future, and I hope our paths cross again soon.
Sounds good, man. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
This has been the On All Cylinders podcast.
Powered by Summit Racing.
Check out new episodes coming soon at OnAllCylinders.com.
OnAllCylinders.com.
Thanks for listening.
See you next time.